courtroom was silent as the gavel struck the wooden bench. Thomas the lawyer stood tall, his gaze unwavering. It had been years since he'd taken on a case like this, one against the government, a case that could change everything. The judge, a stern figure known for his impartiality, glanced over the documents before him. "This is not just another case," Thomas whispered to himself, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones. He could already hear the whispers, the doubt from his peers, the warnings from his friends. They had all said the same thing: don't do it. But Thomas could not back down. This was personal, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the opposing counsel rose to speak, a chill ran down his spine. This wasn't just about legal strategy. It was about fighting for something greater. It was about justice, no matter the cost. The opposing counsel's voice echoed through the courtroom, sharp and condescending. "You think you can win this, Mr. Hart?" he sneered, glancing toward Thomas with a cold smile. "This isn't a battle you can win. You're just a lawyer, a small man trying to take down a giant." The words stung, but Thomas held his ground. He knew what this was. It wasn't just about winning a case, it was about something bigger. He glanced at his notes, finding the courage to speak. "Justice is not for the powerful, it's for everyone," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "And it's for those who are willing to fight for it." The room was quiet for a moment, as if the air itself held its breath. The opposing counsel's smile faded, replaced by a flicker of unease. Thomas had just made his stand, and the real battle had just begun. As the judge called for a recess, Thomas stepped outside, his heart racing. He was on edge, each step feeling heavier than the last. In the hallway, he paused, staring at his reflection in the mirror. "What have I gotten myself into?" he whispered, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the case, the pressure to succeed, the looming presence of the government. It was almost too much. He had already sacrificed so much, but there was no turning back now. This was more than just a case. This was a test of his very soul. He had made a promise, one he couldn't break. And he would fight until the very end. The clock ticked on as Thomas stood before the judge's bench once more. His mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. The case wasn't just about what was on paper. It was about the story behind the law, the hidden truth that would either set him free or destroy everything he had fought for. "We'll proceed with the trial," the judge said, his voice unwavering. "But know this, Mr. Hart, this will be the fight of your life." Thomas nodded silently, feeling the weight of those words settle in his chest. He had known it all along. The fight was never going to be easy. But there was no turning back now. As the session adjourned for the day, Thomas walked back to his office, the weight of the case still hanging heavily on his shoulders. He had come this far, but it was clear that the road ahead would only get harder. "There's no way out now," he muttered to himself, running a hand through his hair. But even as doubt threatened to creep in, he felt a strange sense of clarity. He had a mission, a purpose. The sacrifices would be worth it, he told himself, because the truth was on his side. And no matter the consequences, he would fight until the very end. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. Thomas sat alone in his office, poring over the case files late into the night, when a single document caught his eye, a small detail he had missed before. It was a brief mention of a government official with ties to the corporation at the heart of the case. His pulse quickened as he read the line over and over again. This was the link he needed. This was the key to unlocking everything. He didn't have much time. The trial was set to resume in just a few days. He knew that if he could prove the connection, it would be a game-changer. But he also knew that exposing this could put him in even greater danger. Still, he had no choice. He had come too far to back down now. With newfound determination, he picked up the phone, calling his trusted investigator. "Get me everything on this official," he said, his voice cold with purpose. The real fight was about to begin. The next day, Thomas met with his investigator, Sarah, in a nondescript cafe on the edge of town. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the hum of quiet conversation. Sarah slid a manila folder across the table. "I've got what you need," she said quietly. Thomas opened it, his eyes scanning the contents rapidly. The name of the government official jumped off the page, confirming everything he feared. Not only was the official directly involved with the corporation, but there were also financial ties and secret meetings that had taken place behind closed doors. "This is bigger than we thought," Thomas muttered under his breath. "We're not just fighting a case anymore, we're fighting an entire system." Sarah leaned forward, her face grave. "If you go public with this, you'll be putting yourself in the line of fire. Are you ready for that?" Thomas's jaw clenched. "I don't have a choice," he said. "Justice needs to be served." As the days passed, Thomas began to feel the weight of the case more than ever. His every step was calculated, every move measured. The pressure from all sides was mounting. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. And when he did sleep, his dreams were filled with images of the courtroom, of the judge's gavel slamming down, of the cold, accusing faces of the government officials. The stakes were too high. One wrong move, and everything he had worked for would crumble. But there was no turning back now. He was in too deep. When the day of the trial arrived, he stood at the podium, facing the judge. His heart raced, but he steadied himself. This was the moment he had been preparing for. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, thickening the air with anticipation. He took a deep breath and began his opening statement, his voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, what we are about to uncover will shake the very foundation of this government's integrity." The trial unfolded with a ferocity Thomas hadn't anticipated. Every question was met with resistance, every argument countered with political maneuvering. His opponent, the government's lawyer, was a master of obfuscation, twisting every piece of evidence and turning it against him. But Thomas refused to back down. He dug deeper, presenting evidence that seemed to make the government's position more indefensible by the minute. Yet, there was something strange in the air, a feeling that this battle was becoming less about the law and more about something darker. As the trial continued, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, waiting for him to slip up. That night, as he was preparing for the next day's session, he received an anonymous phone call. "We know what you're doing, Thomas. You need to stop. Or else." The line went dead. He stared at the phone, his heart pounding. It was a threat. And it was real. The following morning, Thomas didn't know whether to be more afraid of the case or the threat looming over him. But he couldn't back down now. As he walked into the courtroom, he noticed the shift. The atmosphere had changed. The air felt thick, and every face in the room seemed to be watching him. His opponent's smug expression had returned, and the judge's eyes seemed colder than ever. It was clear that the stakes had been raised, and the pressure was beginning to take its toll. Thomas began his cross-examination of the government official, his mind sharp and focused. But as the questioning continued, the weight of the threat on his life hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. For the first time, Thomas doubted whether he could win this fight. But, as he locked eyes with the government official across the room, he knew there was no turning back. He was committed, no matter what it cost him. The court proceedings had been dragging on for weeks, each session filled with a new wave of frustration. Thomas's confidence began to waver as he watched the government's legal team continue to manipulate the evidence, presenting half-truths and shadows of reality. The deeper he dug, the more twisted the case became. The once clear path ahead was now shrouded in doubt. Then a key witness, a whistleblower who had agreed to testify, disappeared overnight. The news came as a gut punch. Thomas rushed to his investigator's office, his mind racing with thoughts of the worst-case scenario. "This can't be happening," he muttered to himself, trying to keep his calm. Sarah was already waiting for him, her face grim. "The witness is gone, Thomas. We're in trouble." He slammed his fist on the table, frustration boiling over. "We can't let them win. We have to find her." The clock was ticking, and Thomas felt the pressure mounting, each second passing with the weight of the case growing heavier. As days passed, Thomas and Sarah scoured every lead they could find, relentlessly tracking down any trace of the missing witness. It felt like they were chasing ghosts. Then, just as hope began to fade, Sarah received an anonymous tip. The whistleblower had been seen at a secluded cabin just outside the city. Thomas didn't hesitate for a second. He knew this was their only chance to get back on track. "Let's go," he said, determination lighting up his eyes. They drove for hours. The silence between them filled only with the sound of the car's engine and the occasional rustle of papers, as Thomas sifted through case files in the passenger seat. When they arrived at the cabin, everything seemed still. The air was thick with tension, but Thomas wasn't going to let fear stop him now. They approached cautiously, each step bringing them closer to the truth, or another trap set to destroy their case. Inside the cabin, the air was musty, thick with the scent of stale wood and damp earth. The missing witness, a young woman with a fear-stricken expression, stood in the corner, looking more like a prisoner than a whistleblower. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They'll find you too." Thomas stepped forward, his eyes softening with empathy, despite the fear creeping into his own chest. "We need your testimony," he said gently, but with urgency. "The truth has to come out." The woman hesitated, glancing out the small window as if expecting someone to appear at any moment. "They told me to stay quiet," she whispered. "They promised me safety if I just went away." Thomas took a deep breath. The situation was more dangerous than he had imagined, but he couldn't back down. He wouldn't. "You're not alone in this," he said, stepping closer, trying to reassure her. But deep down he knew the danger was escalating, and that they were being watched. As they prepared to leave the cabin, the door suddenly burst open with a violent crash. Two men, wearing dark suits and sunglasses, stormed into the room. The woman screamed, but Thomas acted fast, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the back door. "Run!" he yelled, adrenaline surging through his veins. They dashed through the woods, branches whipping at their faces, their breath ragged in the cold night air. Behind them the men pursued relentlessly. Thomas's heart pounded as they pushed through the underbrush, trying to lose their pursuers. "We have to get to the car," he shouted, glancing over his shoulder. The sound of footsteps grew louder. It was a race, but Thomas wasn't sure they were going to make it. The stakes had never felt so real. The fight had moved from the courtroom to the woods, and the outcome was far from certain. As the car came into sight, a shot rang out. Thomas pushed the woman into the back seat, throwing himself in after her. The engine roared to life just as another shot pierced the night air. They were barely out of danger, but they had survived. Back at Thomas's office, the adrenaline from their escape was slowly wearing off. They were safe for now, but the events of the night had shaken them all. The whistleblower was shaken, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quiet, filled with fear. Thomas sat down across from her, his mind racing. "Now, we take what you have and make it count," he said firmly. He glanced at Sarah, who nodded, signaling that they had to act quickly. They had the evidence now, but Thomas knew they couldn't rely on the courts anymore. They needed to go public, bring the truth to light in a way that couldn't be ignored. It was risky, but there was no other choice. "We have to expose them," he said. "And we'll do whatever it takes." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The next phase of the battle had begun, and there would be no turning back. The trial had reached a critical point. Thomas could feel the pressure mounting with every passing moment. He had exposed so many lies, and the government's defense was on the ropes. But in the back of his mind there was something nagging at him, a feeling of unease. The whispers had started, not just from the outside world, but within his own team. Late one evening, as Thomas reviewed new evidence, his phone buzzed with a text message. "Meet me at the usual place. There's something you need to know." It was from David, a close colleague he trusted completely. But when Thomas arrived at their meeting spot, it wasn't David who showed up. Instead, it was someone else entirely, the face of a long-forgotten ally who had betrayed him years ago. "Thomas," the man said with a cold smirk, "we need to talk, and I think you'll want to listen." Betrayal stung like a poison, coursing through Thomas's veins as the truth of the man's involvement with the opposition became clear. "I thought you were on my side," Thomas said, his voice low, filled with disbelief. The man standing before him, once a trusted ally, had sold him out. The revelation hit harder than any courtroom defeat. "You don't understand," the man replied, his voice dripping with regret, but with an edge of finality. "There's no winning this case. Not for you. Not for anyone. They've already won." Thomas's chest tightened as he listened. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was strategic. The man had been feeding information to the opposition, ensuring that the government's legal team always stayed one step ahead. "You've been playing me this whole time," Thomas growled, stepping closer, his fists clenched. The man nodded solemnly. "It was never about you winning. It was about keeping them from losing." Thomas took a step back, the crushing weight of the truth settling in. "You've ruined everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've ruined me." The confrontation ended with nothing but silence. Thomas turned and walked away, the weight of the betrayal hanging heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know where to go, what to do next. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of everything. As he entered his apartment, the phone rang. It was Sarah, her voice urgent. "Thomas, you need to see this." She sent over a file with new evidence, something that had been overlooked during the investigation. It was a transcript from a meeting, one where the government officials had openly discussed their involvement in the conspiracy. "This is it," Thomas whispered to himself. This was the break he needed. But the thrill of discovery was short-lived. He knew the stakes had just risen higher. His own team had turned on him, and now he was facing an uphill battle against the very people he once trusted. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he couldn't stop now. The following days were a blur. With the new evidence in hand, Thomas prepared to present it in court, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. The government had already begun to cover its tracks, and his personal betrayal had made him a target. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable as Thomas presented the damning transcript. He watched as the judge's expression hardened, and the government's lawyers tried to shift the focus, but it was too late. The truth was out. But as Thomas looked around the room, he noticed something troubling. The judge seemed unusually distant, his eyes not focused on the evidence, but instead on something off to the side. For a brief moment, their gazes locked, and Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. This wasn't just a trial, it was becoming a game. And he wasn't sure who was playing whom anymore. That night, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. His apartment was eerily quiet, and every little sound made him jump. He had received a cryptic message from Sarah earlier. "Be careful. They know where you are." He wasn't sure if it was paranoia or a legitimate threat, but the last few weeks had made him second-guess everything. As he looked out the window, the city seemed to close in around him. Just then his phone rang again. It was an unknown number. "Thomas, if you want to keep your life, you'll drop the case. Now." The voice was distorted, but the message was clear. The fear gripped him, but he knew he couldn't stop now. His mission was bigger than just him. The fight for justice had taken a dark turn, and now there was no way out. "I'm not stopping," he said, his voice steady but filled with the cold determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable. The judge had called for a final session, and the air was thick with anticipation. Thomas stood at the podium, his hands gripping the edge for support, his pulse hammering in his ears. The government had thrown every obstacle in his way, but now, with the weight of the truth in his hands, it was time to expose everything. The evidence was undeniable. As he presented his final arguments, he could feel the room shift. The collective realization that they were on the edge of something monumental. "What we've uncovered is not just corruption. It's the collapse of justice itself," Thomas said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "This case is not just about a few wrongdoers. It's about all of us who have been silenced by a system that serves the few, not the many. It's about all the lives that have been ruined in the name of power and greed." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. This was it. There was no going back. The opposing counsel stood, his face twisted in frustration as he tried to counter Thomas's claims. This is nothing but an attempt to destroy reputations, he argued. You have no real evidence, no tangible proof. But Thomas was prepared. He pulled out a final document, a recording of a high-level government meeting where officials discussed the manipulation of the system. The room went still. The government's lawyer faltered, his earlier arrogance evaporated. This is it, Thomas thought. This is the moment I have been waiting for. He looked at the judge, who was now intently listening to the recording. The weight of the truth was undeniable. This evidence speaks for itself, Thomas said, his voice cutting through the room. You can't deny what's been done. And you can't ignore the lives that have been destroyed. The words echoed in the courtroom, sealing their fate. As the final moments of the trial approached, Thomas felt a sense of dread hanging over him. The defense was relentless, and the judge's impartiality had come into question. Every word felt like it might be his last opportunity to turn the tide in his favor. He turned to address the judge directly. Your Honor, we're not just talking about laws being broken, he said, his voice steady. We're talking about the soul of our nation, the very idea that justice can be bought and sold. His words were impassioned, fueled by the belief that if he couldn't win this case, the system itself would lose all meaning. This case is about all of us who have been silenced, all of us who have been crushed under the weight of power. This is not just about one case. It's about restoring faith in justice. The room was silent, hanging on his every word as he made his final stand. The decision was now in the hands of the judge. The moments before the verdict were the longest Thomas had ever experienced. His heart raced as he sat in the defendant's seat, waiting. The judge had taken his time deliberating, but Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Suddenly, the door to the courtroom opened, and the judge entered. The room fell silent. We've reached a verdict, the judge said, his voice echoing through the room. Thomas's palms were clammy, his mind racing with possibilities. He had won before, but never like this. The judge glanced at the papers in front of him, his expression unreadable. In light of the evidence presented, I hereby rule in favor of the plaintiff, the judge declared. A wave of relief washed over Thomas, followed by a surge of disbelief. Wait. For a moment, it felt like a dream. The courtroom erupted into chaos, but Thomas stood still, feeling the weight of the victory settle over him. This was the moment he had fought for, the moment he had risked everything to achieve. The celebration was short-lived. As Thomas left the courthouse, he knew that the real work was just beginning. Justice had been served, but the fight was far from over. The government would appeal, and the media would scrutinize every decision he had made. But for now, Thomas allowed himself a brief moment of peace. He stood outside, looking up at the sky, breathing in the fresh air as the weight of the battle finally lifted. He had done it. But in the back of his mind, he knew that victory in court didn't mean the end of the fight. There were still people who would try to bring him down, still people who would seek to silence him. But he was ready for whatever came next. He had stood up to the system, and he had won. And now, there was nothing left to do but keep fighting. Because for Thomas, justice was never a destination, it was a journey. The morning after the verdict, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled deep in his gut. He had won the case, but the victory felt hollow. The media was already circling, trying to dissect every detail of the trial, questioning the integrity of the legal system, and even casting doubts on his motives. The headlines screamed, David versus Goliath. Lawyer takes on government, but at what cost? The news outlets questioned if justice had truly been served, or if this was just another case of manipulation in the public eye. As he stood in his office, staring out the window at the bustling city, he realized that his life would never be the same. He had fought hard, but now the consequences of that fight were just beginning to unfold. The phone rang, pulling him back to reality. It was Sarah. "We need to talk," she said, her voice tight. "I think someone's been keeping an eye on you." The shadows of the past were closing in once again. The conversation with Sarah was unsettling. She had managed to uncover something troubling. It seemed that the government wasn't going to accept their loss quietly. Behind the scenes, whispers were growing louder. Powerful figures were making plans to discredit Thomas, to silence him, and to erase the trial from the public's memory. "You've got to be careful," Sarah warned. "They're already planning their next move." Thomas's grip tightened around the phone. He had expected resistance, but he hadn't anticipated the full extent of the backlash. They weren't just going to fight him in the courts. They were going to fight him in the streets, in the media, in every corner of the public eye. "I'll be ready," Thomas replied, though doubt crept into his voice. "I've made too many enemies to turn back now." Sarah's voice softened. "I know you'll fight, but it's going to get worse before it gets better. Just be careful." The line went dead. The weight of the battle ahead pressed down on him more than ever. Days passed in a blur of media scrutiny, protests, and endless meetings with his legal team. The case was over, but the war wasn't. The government had launched a campaign to undermine his victory, sowing doubt at every turn. The public had grown divided, with some hailing him as a hero, while others branded him a troublemaker, a thorn in the side of an already fragile system. The tension took its toll on Thomas. He spent his nights walking the city streets, trying to clear his mind. But everywhere he went, he was recognized. People stared at him, whispered behind his back, and he couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. The world that had once seemed so familiar now felt foreign and hostile. One night, as he walked along the river, he encountered a familiar face, someone from his past who had once warned him of this path. "You're in too deep," the man said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "The moment you exposed them, you made yourself a target." Thomas didn't know how to respond. He'd known the risks, but the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The phone rang again the next morning. This time, it was a new threat. Anonymous, but all too real. "You're not safe," the voice warned. "The truth won't protect you. If you keep going, you'll lose more than just your career." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest as the voice faded into the silence. He knew what this meant. They had crossed the line from legal warfare to personal attacks. But he wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He spent the next few days meeting with his team, strategizing ways to protect himself and the case from further backlash. But as the days wore on, the feeling of paranoia only deepened. He couldn't trust anyone, not completely. Every corner he turned felt like another potential threat. The victory in court had been his, but the cost had been far higher than he'd ever imagined. The momentary relief he had felt after the trial was now replaced by a sense of dread, a constant awareness that the fight had only just begun. Despite the constant pressure, Thomas refused to surrender. He knew the battle was far from over, but he had come too far to back down now. As he sat in his office late one evening, staring at the file containing the final evidence of the conspiracy, he realized something profound. The fight was no longer about winning in the court of law. It was about exposing the truth, no matter the cost. His name had become synonymous with defiance, and while many would try to tear him down, he knew his legacy would be defined by his unwavering pursuit of justice. As he picked up his pen to continue his work, a single thought echoed in his mind. This is what it means to fight for what's right. The system may try to break him, but he wouldn't be silenced. He couldn't be. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The days had become a blur of legal battles, public scrutiny, and constant threats. But despite everything, Thomas knew the final decision was approaching. His phone had become a source of constant anxiety, with new messages arriving every hour, some supportive, others filled with animosity. The media had turned on him, questioning his motives and calling his victory into doubt. He hadn't anticipated the personal toll the case would take. Each phone call, each news report, each whisper behind his back chipped away at his resolve. But now, standing alone in his office as he looked out over the city, he felt something stir within him, an undeniable urge to move forward. It was time to make his final decision, the one that would define not just his career, but his life. His eyes narrowed, and a sense of clarity washed over him. "This is what it means to fight for justice," he whispered to himself. No matter what happened next, he would stand by his choices. The decision had been made. Thomas could no longer remain in the shadows of his own fear. It was time to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how daunting they were. That afternoon, he gathered his team for one final meeting. "We've done everything we can," he began, his voice steady. "But this case doesn't end here. It's not just about legal victory anymore, it's about the future." His eyes scanned the room, meeting each member of his team's gaze. They were tired, worn down by the relentless pressure of the fight, but there was something in their eyes that told him they weren't ready to give up. "We've exposed the truth," Thomas continued, "but we have to make sure it stays exposed. We can't let the system bury it. We fight for the truth no matter the cost." The room fell into a heavy silence as they absorbed his words. He could see the doubt in their eyes, but he knew what he had to do. The final phase of the battle was about to begin. As the days passed, Thomas found himself facing the inevitable. The backlash was coming, and it was going to be brutal. The government had launched a media blitz, trying to erase the victory, claiming that the trial was a farce, and Thomas was a pawn in a larger scheme. His name was being dragged through the mud. But Thomas had grown accustomed to the weight of the world bearing down on him. He stood at a press conference, ready to defend not just his actions, but the very ideals he had fought for. The reporters fired questions at him, some accusing, others skeptical, but he stood firm. "I didn't do this for fame. I didn't do it for power," Thomas said, his voice calm yet filled with conviction. "I did it for justice, for the truth. And no matter how hard you try to bury it, the truth will come to light." The reporters fell silent, unsure of how to respond. Thomas had made his stand, and there was no turning back. As the final verdict was announced in the appeal, Thomas braced himself for the fallout. The courtroom was packed with anticipation as the judge spoke, his voice heavy with authority. "The original verdict stands." The words reverberated through the room, causing an unexpected surge of relief to flood Thomas's chest. His case, his fight for justice, had been vindicated. The government's attempts to erase the truth had failed. Thomas couldn't help but exhale deeply, his hands trembling slightly. But the victory wasn't complete, not yet. The battle for public opinion, for the trust of the people, was just beginning. He knew that many would never accept the truth, but in that moment, Thomas realized something essential. The law had spoken, and for the first time, he felt the weight of justice on his side. "We won," he whispered to himself. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel a glimmer of hope. In the days that followed, Thomas walked through the streets of the city with a sense of finality. The media had stopped hounding him, and the protests had died down. There was peace now, though it was a fragile peace. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. He had fought for what was right, no matter the cost. He had exposed the truth, and while it hadn't been easy, it was worth it. As he walked past a group of people talking, he overheard one of them mention his name, but this time, it wasn't in anger. It was with respect. The fight had changed him. It had cost him everything, but in the end, he had emerged stronger. He wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He was a symbol of resistance, of standing up against the system. And as he walked through the streets, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. His journey was far from over. The story would continue, and he would continue to fight.